Ah, hello everyone. I think we're live with the Persuaders again.
Indeed.
If anyone's watching and would like to just confirm that we are live, that would be nice. I'm not completely au fait with the technicalities of this, but I think we're working. So we've got a really provocative question today, and it's this: how do you know you're not a zombie? Well, what's a zombie? Zombie is a thing that's not conscious in the phenomenal sense. Okay. What's being conscious in the phenomenal sense? What's phenomenal consciousness? It's supposed to be the most obvious thing in the world. Okay. The one thing you can't doubt is supposedly is that you're phenomenally conscious. Okay. Yet this phenomenal consciousness seems a bit of a strange thing because it doesn't seem to be accessible to investigation by science. When science looks at us, it just is these meat machines that do wonderful stuff, but it doesn't seem to reveal the phenomenal consciousness that is at the heart of our existence. And it seems that we could imagine a duplicate of ourselves that does all the meat stuff, all the information processing and all the reacting to information and so on, without having the phenomenal consciousness. So we've got something extra, something that poses a hard problem for science to explain. And you go off down this route and you get the idea that consciousness isn't physical, that we require some kind of either some revolutionary form of science or some metaphysical innovation to incorporate it into our world picture. Maybe we have to be panpsychists and suppose that all of matter has a bit of this phenomenal consciousness. But all of this depends on the assumption right at the beginning that we know we're not just meat machines. Okay, we know that we have this thing called phenomenal consciousness. We know that we are not zombies. But here comes this chap called Pete Mandic, and he's written a Substack post with the provocative title, if I can remember what it is, You Don't Know You're Not a Zombie. Well, if we don't know we're not a zombie, then all bets are off, right? I mean, the whole thing collapses because that was how we got into the hard problem in the first place. So, Pete.
Hello.
Surely I know I'm not a zombie, right? I mean, isn't that the most obvious fact about my existence, that I have this phenomenal consciousness?
Whenever anyone in philosophy says surely, you should wince. You should cringe.
That's Dan Dennett's little thing.
Yeah.
He would actually do this as you were talking. If anyone said surely, he would go, ting.
Oh, God. So thank you for the introduction. I think you did a nice job setting up the issues and correctly identified this as deliberately provocative. And also that really the target is not so much about zombies, it's about phenomenal consciousness.
Right.
But I like to draw pictures, and I like to draw pictures of zombies. Zombies are really fun to draw, in part because no matter how badly you screw it up, it still looks like a terrible monster that's, rotting. It's very hard to draw a beautiful person, but you could just screw up the zombie and say, there's the zombie. So anyway, first some preliminaries before really diving into what I think of as the heart of the argument. One preliminary is Keith, you nicely pointed out. We're talking about so-called phenomenal consciousness. There might be all sorts of other kinds of consciousness that are perfectly fine in my book. So-called access consciousness, which Ned Block, who introduces the phrase phenomenal consciousness in 1995, also introduces the phrase access consciousness. And this kind of distinction shows up in almost the same time, mid 90s, in Chalmers' distinction between hard problems and easy problems of consciousness. So phenomenal consciousness is like hard problem consciousness. Access consciousness and other kinds of consciousness are easy problem consciousness. And I say this because a lot of people might hear this and say, what? There's no consciousness? Then how can you even be awake? Or like, how can you even see that you have a thermos and then drink the water? And the answer is, well, because I'm conscious, and I'm conscious of the thermos. There's all sorts of consciousness that I think is perfectly fine, but this alleged phenomenal consciousness is really what the argument is an argument against. And
it's
zombies,
almost like this distinction between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness was introduced just to prevent people giving some alternative functional account of consciousness, isn't it?
One might be tempted to wonder such a thing. It's hard to pin that down, because I think a lot of people correctly point out that a lot of these ideas have been around for hundreds of years. Not exactly as such, but like obviously Leibniz is worried about some of this sort of stuff, and we could pin some of this down on stuff that goes all the way back to Aristotle. And I'm sure the Eastern traditions have all sorts of versions of these sorts of. So I hesitate to say Ned Block or David Chalmers or anybody in the 20th century just like invented this thing whole cloth for nefarious purposes. I think it's way more complicated and subtle than that. Nonetheless, we do have a relatively clear target in the mid 90s of people talking about this kind of consciousness where when they start doing their zombie arguments against physicalism, that's what they're talking about. But it's also the kind of consciousness that Mary, the futuristic neuroscientist, in the knowledge argument really couldn't know about just by reading about it. It's that kind of consciousness. It's the kind of consciousness that many people say is especially difficult to imagine being implemented in a robot. Maybe there's some sense in which a robot or even a thermostat could know or be aware of or conscious of the temperature or the color of objects in its environment, but not in the phenomenal sense of consciousness. So that's our target. And zombies are kind of a useful way of focusing on some of these philosophical debates and also grabbing people's attention with a drawing of a zombie from the horror movie Zombies. Another thing that's
you seem to be doing a good job of articulating the need for this notion.
No one needs any of this. No one needs this. And there is a potentially serious concern here because so much of consciousness, I think, is perfectly non-confused and invites very interesting questions, and some of which we would need a lot more funding and people power to investigate. And unfortunately, resources and talent have been diverted into this phenomenal consciousness stuff, to our collective detriment, or so I think. But another thing about zombies that I think is worth mentioning is that zombies are defined negatively in terms of phenomenal consciousness. It's not like we discovered zombies and then we thought, like, what's going on with these weird people? Maybe they lack phenomenal consciousness. It's this invention. A zombie is someone who lacks phenomenal consciousness, but that's all they lack. They are otherwise just like us in all sorts of ways, behaviorally just like us, or functionally just like us, or physically just like us. But there's supposed to be some unproblematic way in which they're just like us. But then, by definition, they don't have phenomenal consciousness.
Well, so they're supposed to be like us in all third person characterizable aspects, right? So
yeah, they're supposed to be like us in all the ways that are left over when you screen off phenomenal consciousness and anything that's like directly logically entailed by phenomenal consciousness.
Well, when you screen off the first person subjective perspective, the perspective from which a creature knows what it's like to be them, right?
Yeah, assuming that means anything, that's presumably what you're trying to do. And so where I come in is to raise questions about, well, whether that means anything. And a lot of the way I try to articulate the argument is in terms of concepts and knowing what you're thinking about, which we can get a handle on by talking about similar sorts of questions with respect to speaking, knowing what you're speaking about, or knowing what you're talking about, or knowing what someone else is talking about. But like in our last episode, I'm really interested here in concepts and not specifically about language,
Right.
although language is a useful entry into all of this. And so I think maybe it might be useful to just kind of start with a warm-up exercise to see how concepts figure in to general and easy to understand claims about when someone has a concept, or when somebody is talking about something, or somebody is learning a concept. And then we could pick out key elements of what's happening there and see how that all ends up really falling apart in very important ways when we shift our attention to the alleged case of like having a phenomenally conscious state privately that you inwardly try to think about. Or so
it's like this. I'm you can't be sure I'm not a zombie because you can only look at me from the third person perspective, but I'm supposed to know that I'm not a zombie. I'm supposed to, so
right.
Right now, your point is that if I know I'm not a zombie, then I've got to have or I know that I have phenomenal consciousness.
Yeah.
I've got to be able to think the thought I have phenomenal consciousness,
right.
and I'm absolutely sure it's true. So I've got to have the means to construct that thought, and that involves having the concept of phenomenal consciousness. Okay, so you're going to press on that point to begin with. How do I know that I have this bit of mental apparatus I need to think the thought?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay,
that's exactly right. Brilliant.
Let's go with that then.
So let's talk about smartphones.
All right.
Now, I take for granted that you know what a smartphone is, and we might also say that you have the concept of a smartphone.
Right.
But imagine somebody who doesn't. I have children that not long ago, they didn't know what a smartphone was. They see mommy and daddy looking at a rectangle instead of the children. But what's going on there? What is a smartphone? And so let's talk a little bit about how one might come to obtain the concept of a smartphone. Right. I assume, although maybe there are hardcore nativists who think you're born with the concept of a smartphone. I just assume that's not what happens. And I'm talking about acquiring the concept of a smartphone, and not simply learning that the English word smartphone is how you express that concept you might have already had as a non-native English speaker. So I might say to somebody, okay, a smartphone is this thing plus other things that are like it.
Right.
So in order to understand that much, you have to have some way of thinking about this thing. Now, you don't yet have the ability to think of it as a smartphone.
Right.
Because by hypothesis, you don't yet have the concept of a smartphone. But you are able to think about it in some other way. You're able to think of it as that rectangular thing that this person is holding in their hand and pointing at.
Right.
You're able to think of it as, as described by what next comes out of my mouth. I might describe it as a machine that is able to allow people to talk to each other remotely without the use of wires. And it also contains computing capabilities that allows it to run programs, process data, access the internet. Now, I've said a whole bunch of things that the person who doesn't yet have the concept of a smartphone might nonetheless have the concept of. They might already have the concept of the internet. They might already have the concept of telephony and talking to people remotely without the use of wires. So in order to acquire the concept of a smartphone, they have some other way of conceptualizing that thing. And it's worth noting that their way of conceptualizing that thing isn't merely that they hear the word that or can follow a finger pointing at it. There's all this other stuff that has to be going on, which we could recognize is about their prior concepts that they have prior to the acquisition of the concept of a smartphone. If I instead of saying that stuff that I said, I was trying to teach someone what a smartphone was simply by holding it up in front of their face and saying smartphone, smartphone, smartphone. What? Like, that's not going to
Right.
give them the concept of a smartphone.
Or it's going to give them a very different concept of a smartphone. That's all that, say, a dog could have. You know,
It might give them a little something, right? If they, for example, are able to see and move their eyes around and stuff like that, they can have some kind of grasp of like, okay, I'm looking over here versus I'm looking over there. Or if they have some kind of way of parsing the world into objects, right? They're developed enough so that their object visual object detection and tracking system is on board. Then they can carve the world into like, oh yeah, there's that thing, that person that's talking, and they're holding an object, and that's all stuff that we kind of take for granted that babies and other creatures are able to do. But if you get into the cognitive science stuff behind all that, that's really kind of miraculous, like visual object recognition, trying to like parse the visually presented array into discrete objects and kind of zero in on this as an object and appreciate that this is separate from my hand, even though there might be it just in pure raw image, very similar levels of shading and color shared by the hand and the object. So even to get that far as like, okay, it's that thing. Somehow it's that thing that's the smartphone. I might not know anything else about it. Even that is to already have some concept of the smartphone. You might not have the full concept of the smartphone yet, and you're not going to get it until there's a lot of extra stuff in there. One thing that's really important for seeing how this stuff might apply to so-called phenomenal consciousness is appreciating how weird things start getting when we want to shift our attention from things to properties of things.
Right.
This is a really big deal for the phenomenal consciousness discussions, which are all about these supposed properties that science can't tell us about.
Right.
It's not about, in most cases, these supposed things and the sorts of arguments that you see in the arguments between substance monists and substance dualists,
right,
which are about whether there are special mental things versus the physical things. Most of the contemporary discussion surrounding phenomenal consciousness has been about whether there are these special properties of mental states, like what we might call the phenomenal character, or the what it's like properties, or the qualia, or the qualitative properties, blah, 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 blah. We're talking about properties. And so we got to try to figure out how to get this basic kind of story about like the smartphone, et cetera, and change it so that we're talking about properties of things instead of things themselves. And immediately we start running into difficulty. So it's one thing for me to get a baby or a dog or even an adult who might not share a lot of my language to like track the object and attend to this object instead of that object. But suppose I wanted to draw your attention to one property of this object and not some other property of the object. If the properties are anywhere, they're probably where the object is. So if I wanted to get you to attend to the shape of this object instead of the color of the object, or vice versa, how am I going to point at it? You might say, well, maybe you trace around the shape, but how is that not tracing around the color? It seems like we're now trying to cut things into a finer grain than plain old pointing or directing your eyes or shifting your visual attention around the spatial field is really going to get at. It's only when we start bringing language into it that we're able to get at these property differences. People that are philosophy of language and logic nerds might appreciate that we're trying to get into intentionality with an S instead of just plain old extensionality. If that lingo goes over your head, that's fine. Ignore it. But in order for me to get you to attend to the shape instead of the color, the one property versus the other, I now need to get you to conceptualize the shape versus the color, or to think about the shape versus the color.
Right.
What else could attending to the one versus the other possibly be?
Mhm.
So we have all sorts of different models in common sense, in philosophy of mind, in cognitive science, in computer engineering for attention.
Mhm.
There's all sorts of ways we use the word attention in theoretical and non-theoretical contexts. And one way of attending is to attend to different properties of one and the same thing. As best as anyone can tell what that would be thinking. If I'm attending to the color instead of the shape of the smartphone, I'm thinking about the color instead of thinking about the shape, which seems to require that you have the concept of color and are employing the concept of color, or you have the concept of shape and you're applying the concept of shape. That seems especially clear when we're talking about really fairly abstract properties of things, like being made on a Friday, or being artificial instead of natural. All sorts of things that it's really hard to believe are innate, part of our inborn capacity, or parts
Mhm.
of like low level sensory processing. Like Fridayness is just not in the early sensory channel. I have to learn all sorts of stuff to be able to mentally access Fridayness. So it seems like the concept story of how that works is like the only plausible story. Okay, we're ready to go inside, where
Right.
allegedly one learns what phenomenal consciousness is. And the story goes something like, no one can really tell you what it is, because if they could tell you what it is, then they could tell Mary, the super neuroscientist who hasn't left the black and white room yet. It could just be written in her book. Um, if someone could just tell you what it is, we could take what they said and decompose it into a functional architecture and implement it in a robot. There's all sorts of reasons why the typical stories that are told about phenomenal consciousness avoid allowing that anyone could just tell you what it is. So then how could you possibly know what it is? It has to be something like, well, on the inside, you attend to it.
Mhm.
Okay, but how do you do that? How do you attend to it? So I have a mental state. Like, for example, right now I have a mental state of seeing that there's a piece of furniture behind you that's got a red cloth draped on it. I don't know even what that is, Keith, and please don't tell me. A few weeks ago, I thought maybe it was a hardware cabinet. Now maybe it's possibly a chair with a blanket over it. But I do have this visual perceptual state as of there being a red thing behind you. Now that state of me is something that, if it exists, it has all sorts of properties. It might have the property of being a state that Abraham Lincoln was once in. Abraham Lincoln once saw something as being a red blanket. It might have the property of being the 17th time I've had a red experience today. It might have the property of being constituted by or supervening upon thousands of neural activations inside of my nervous system. There's all sorts of properties that it has. It has property of never having been far from the planet Earth. All sorts of properties. Which of those properties are the ones I'm attending to when I think of it as an example of phenomenal consciousness?
Mhm. Mhm.
Well, it has, like, I have to somehow have a grip on that property
Mhm.
before I can acquire the concept of phenomenal consciousness.
Mhm.
But how do I have that grip? How do I attend to that property
Mhm.
and not the property of having so and so neurons firing, without already having the concept of phenomenal consciousness with which I think about that property?
Mhm.
So you wind up with this picture whereby the content of the concept of phenomenal consciousness is that property that you think about when you think about phenomenal consciousness.
Mhm. Mhm.
But that should sound terrible. That should sound kind of like someone saying this sentence is true. Okay, wait a minute. What are you saying about that sentence? You're saying that it's true. Okay, well, if it's true, then it's accurately representing something. Is it accurately representing something? It's accurately representing something if it's accurately representing itself as accurately representing itself. But is it? And there's a real sense in which that's kind of a weirder problem than the liar paradox. Right? That this sentence is false paradox. Is it true? Is it false? Is it neither? Is it both? That's a hard problem, but in some way we have a handle on it that, well, it's not easy to say much about, but maybe it's false, or maybe it's meaningless. But this sentence is true in a weird way is harder to solve than that, because
so the idea
it could be true, but like you couldn't, if it was, you couldn't even get a handle on what that would be.
We can't, so we can attend to our own experiences, we can sort of try to, but we can't pick out the relevant aspect that is supposed to be causing the problem. Is that
right? So there's a way of allowing that there are experiences.
Or, well,
maybe you allow that there are experiences in the access consciousness sense of experiences, or you just allow that there are experiences in this, that you say there's a kind of mental state, and maybe you are just silent about whether it's any kind of consciousness whatsoever. It's mental in some other way that may or may not have to do with consciousness. So if we want to just talk about the states themselves without singling out some specific property of them, then we have ways of doing that. But a lot of these debates are about whether there are these certain kinds of properties, and whether these properties have these higher order, like modal properties of being necessary properties, or contingent, or the properties only contingently associated with physical properties. Or
so I asked that because I assume that the difficulty is picking out the right aspect of our experiences, because you don't have any difficulty picking out the right aspect of, when you were talking about the redness of the rug, you don't have any difficulty with that concept.
Yeah, that's fine.
Right. Okay, so here I'm playing devil's advocate. That's all you need. The concepts of sensible properties, the properties of things in the world. You're richly equipped with these. Okay, let's just stick with color, redness. Okay, so to get the concept of a red phenomenal property, a red quality, you start with that concept. Okay, so you pick out that aspect of the world that is, tracked by that concept, and then you add, but that isn't really where it seems to be, because that, because you learn about the way that light and so on. So you add a theoretical bit onto that property that seems to be out there is actually somewhere else. It's actually a mental property. What does that mean? I don't know, but it's not a property that's actually spatially located out there in the world. It's somehow more intimately connected with you and your mind than that. Somehow you're producing it and projecting it, as it were, onto the world. Now, okay, you can find all sorts of problems with that, but isn't that enough to get you to what people are focusing on?
Yeah, maybe. I think it's worth taking it in steps. There was a particular point in your story where I got more uncomfortable. I don't know if anyone noticed that, but the first step I was fine with. Like, there's this property out there that's sensible.
Sensible.
That's easy to get a handle on. I could, get a whole bunch of different animals, and we could construct some third-person tests and decide between ourselves which of these aminals. I said aminals live on air. Which of these animals are able to discriminate blue from green, and which of them aren't able to discriminate blue from green. And there's all sorts of ways you and I could describe blue from green without referencing anyone's visual capacities. I could just say, like, light of this wavelength, or surfaces that reflect light of this wavelength. I'm not necessarily even carving it into what humans are able to, right? There's just a way that we could say, like, these lizards are able to discriminate these two different spectral differences just by using their eyes, but these butterflies aren't. So that kind of like that much awareness or consciousness so far, no problem. And we could talk about the properties of which the animals are aware or tracking or sensitive to. Things start to feel a little fishy though when someone comes along and says, "Hey, you know those properties that you're aware of, those properties aren't out there." Now we're getting into the very strange case of intentional identity that, you know, like Peter Geach made famous with the case of like the witch. Assuming there are no such thing as witches. Here's a story. There's you know, some farmer heard that the farmer next door's cow died by getting a curse put on it by a witch. And then the first farmer wonders if that's the same witch that put a curse on his cow. Right. Okay. Well, how would we know whether it is the same witch? Under the assumption that there is no witch, how do we know whether they're talking about or thinking about the same witch?
Right.
That's a really weird and strange problem. I'm not saying that it's a terrible problem or it's an irresolvable problem, but things do get a little trickier now. And so we would have to get into something like, well, in the case of the farmers, what in general is the way in which the farmers represent things, including things that we think are there, and how much do they meaning the way the one farmer represents stuff in general and the way the other farmer represents stuff in general, how much do they match such that we could say with any kind of confidence that they're thinking about the same witch as opposed to two different witches? And once you get that deep into it, you might appreciate that there's kind of probably in some sense no answer there.
So you're applying this then into to the external red and the putative internal red, and saying, how can we know we're talking about the same problem?
It seems like if you say like that property isn't really there,
right? You're
already attributing to me that I've got some kind of representation, which is a false representation. It is in part about things that don't exist. And so I'm not saying that like you've already in as much trouble as I'm accusing the phenomenal consciousness people as being in, but I do think like we're getting into slightly weird territory. But
let's
wait,
make it.
I wanted. Okay. Before we go any further, I just want to briefly at least advertise what I think maybe the problem is already at both stages, with saying why couldn't that be phenomenal consciousness? And aside from the answer of, well, anything could be phenomenal consciousness if you wanted to call it phenomenal consciousness, right? That's the easy one to take. But suppose you wanted to match up with what the Blocks and the Chalmers thought they were talking about. Well, you would need it to match up with the Mary story. You would need it to match up with
right.
You know, the zombie story and the robot story. But let's just focus on Mary. If at the first stage, we're just talking about properties that are out there that the lizards can detect, differentially detect, but the butterflies can't. The butterflies cannot make those spectral discriminations, but the lizards can. Well, Black and White Mary, who perhaps cannot see those colors, nonetheless knows those colors are there. There's all sorts of ways she can know those colors are there. She could have been blind from birth, Mary, and still know that there's such and such electromagnetic frequency with such and such, differential effects on such and such animals. So you wouldn't get Mary if you thought like the Mary intuition is important for defining what phenomenal consciousness, the phenomenal consciousness story is supposed to be a story about. It also seems like you wouldn't get the robot or anti-functionalist intuitions. Just like everything we said about the lizards and the butterflies, we could build robots that do that. So it doesn't seem like any mystery about it. It might be a little bit of a difficult engineering problem But in many cases, we've already solved that problem. We already have automated color matchers. You could get a free app that helps you like match photograph colors to hex codes. In different kinds of canonical color representation schemes. So in some sense, like, that's a very easy problem. We've literally solved that problem. And if phenomenal consciousness is supposed to be like hard problem consciousness or like apparent hard problem consciousness, then we don't have that. If you switch to the next phase where you just start talking about like what I'm calling the intentional reading, where, instead of tracking properties that are out there, we're saying like, oh, there are these properties you thought were out there, but you were wrong about that. Already we're now attributing representational contents. But nonetheless, Mary might be able to know about all of that too. She might be able to parse that. These creatures are, there might be a class of creatures that is subject to a systematic set of color illusions or color hallucinations. They are able to track a bunch of different external stimuli, but the very same system that they use to do that, their visual system, the one hooked up to their eyeballs, also responds in these kind of systematic ways to no consistent external stimulus. And so she might find herself saying like, yeah, the visual system in these lizards is fairly good at tracking these environmental features in a way that we could like give a representational gloss on, and then we could identify certain states that it's in that seem to satisfy all the other criteria for being representational, except they're never accurate. They're always representing falsely. They're always hallucinating. I'm not saying like, it might be overwhelming that you have to interpret the lizards that way, but it seems like not nonsense that Mary might decide that's the best way to describe what's going on with these lizards, that these lizards are in touch with some objective colors, but they also have these purely subjective, in the sense of being like kind of hallucinatory, never accurate. So she would be a color illusionist relative to these lizards. I think that's possible. But if that's possible, and it's part of the definition of phenomenal consciousness that Mary can't know about it if she can't herself have the experiences, then it's not phenomenal consciousness. You're talking about something else, not phenomenal consciousness.
I certainly, yeah. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the general perspective you have here, but I still feel you're not saying that there has to be more to the account than just that.
Well, just to be very, very explicit about what I think my argument is doing and how I think my argument works, it might still be a crappy argument, but I think that the argument needs its target. Like the person I'm arguing against is assuming something like the Mary intuition. They're assuming that, like what it's like to see red, that the general concept of like what it's likeness is experience dependent. It's not the sort of thing that you could convey by putting it in a book and giving it to a Mary that never had a phenomenal experience. So that's built into my argumentative target. If you remove that element, I have no argument. And if you want to say phenomenal consciousness is this other thing,
right? Okay, right. Yeah. I mean, so look, here's something that say Nick Humphrey might say. You're looking at an expanse of red. Well, he would say this, I think. And now it might be an actual painted expanse. It might be that you've just been looking at an expanse of green and you've just turned towards a white wall. Okay, and so you're having an after image of red. But there is this powerful thing that's obtruding itself upon your attention, okay? And you have a word for it. It's red. As this redness is somehow being instantiated somewhere or other, in some sense or other. Something's happening that you're tracking with that.
Yep.
Now, nothing about Mary couldn't know about this or whatever.
Right.
There's also a powerful intuition that this is somehow supplied by you, particularly in the case of the after image.
Yep.
right? So there's something here that is somehow subjective in the sense of being supplied by me. It's part of my contribution to whatever's happening here. I'm okay.
By the way, every time I say "yep," that's short for everything you're saying. I'm completely fine with. I affirm that's a thing that happens. I'm not arguing against that.
You were supposed to be. So what was I? So there's some properties. There's something happening here. Some changes occurred somewhere. To some aspect of the world. It's a significant one. I can track it with, I have a word for it. It's redness. It's somehow, it's somehow I'm at least substantially contributing to the occurrence of this property. It's hard to find words to say this carefully now. And I think that is what people are getting at when they talk about phenomenal consciousness, that thing. Now, I don't think...
I wish you were right about that. That would be so great if you were right about that.
Let me say that again. Let me say that again. That is what they should be talking about when they're talking about phenomenal consciousness, because that is tractable. That doesn't pose a hard problem. But it's very easy
and it poses a bunch of really interesting problems.
Yes. It's easy to parley people into thinking that does pose a hard problem, because people can't see how you could give some sort of naturalistic account of that, some account that Mary could comprehend. Now, I think you can. I think Nick Humphrey does a pretty impressive job of doing exactly that, in terms of it being some sort, you're tracking some kind of expressive response to stimulation. This is basically my own view too. And I think Mary could know all about that. But so I think there's a substantive phenomenon here, but one that doesn't immediately entail all the things that phenomenal realists want to say about it. Now, I'm not a zombie in the sense that I do have these sorts of events do occur that I was just trying to describe. Okay, and I think when people imagine a zombie, they imagine someone who doesn't have that kind of stuff. So they don't have these experiences of expanses of red obtruding themselves upon them, or sounds obtruding themselves upon them. Though bizarrely, their bodies still behave as if they do. So they still go, wow, there's a big expanse of red there. And if red has certain kind of emotional effects on them, those all occur and everything. But they're not having this sense of redness. Now, I don't think that's coherent at all, but a lot of people seem to think it is coherent, and they seem to think that it can be quite easily parlayed into the thing that poses a hard problem. So if we use the word phenomenal consciousness, or zombie in that sense for that property, or the absence of that property, then we're fine. So what people are doing is there's a perfectly good sense in which we could extract from this talk of phenomenal consciousness, we could extract a notion that I think we're both happy with, and that we would both think it's bizarre to deny the reality of. But that's not the sense in which it's used in the philosophical literature.
Right.
Are we on board now? Are we on board with each other now?
I believe so. There's a few more things I would want to screen you for to make sure I can trust you.
But I mean, I think so, because then it seems it's not that I can't know that I'm not. I can perfectly well know I'm not a zombie in that sense. It's just that I can't know I'm not a zombie in this under this theoretical gloss that's imposed upon that, because that theoretical gloss, as you say, just doesn't really. Well, it's just things like this can't be characterized in third person terms, can't it? I don't know.
Right.
Well, I do know. I think
there's in order to get what I'm calling phenomenal consciousness, open parentheses, bad version, close parentheses, you need some heavy philosophical concepts and arguments.
Yeah.
You need to be able to invoke things like, for example, and maybe these are all different ways of getting at the same point, but for example, you have to introduce something like mode of presentation and say that while most things in the universe can be subsumed under multiple modes of presentation, what's special about phenomenal consciousness is it's its own mode of presentation. So it's not the case that phenomenal consciousness might be one and the same thing as these brain states.
Right.
Because you can know about the brain states without knowing about phenomenal consciousness. Phenomenal consciousness is the thing that, in order for you to think about it, you have to have the mode of presentation, not just any old mode of presentation. When it comes to things like the planet Venus, you could think about the planet Venus under the mode of presentation, the planet Venus, or you could think of it under the mode of presentation of the second planet from the sun in the solar system without having any idea that that's identical to the planet Venus. You could think of it as the morning star. You could think of it as the evening star. And these are all different modes of presentation of one and the same thing. And none of those modes of presentation are the required mode of presentation that you must use in order to think about the thing, which is the thing we're trying to think about. But allegedly, phenomenal consciousness is different. And that alleged difference is the thing I'm freaking out about.
Yeah.
If
okay.
And hear me freaking out and they think, oh, Mandic is insane. He's freaking out about people seeing red or people having red after images. What a fucking idiot. I mean, I might be a fucking idiot, but not for that reason. I'm freaking out about this very technical thing, which has been smuggled into a lot of places where people don't realize like they've been hoodwinked.
Here's the difference between, because you see, I'm absolutely with you on that. But I think it can't be something that is its own mode of presentation. I don't, you know, but
well, you know, I agree with that.
It's somehow very psychologically tempting to think of it that way. There's something about this sense of, you know, redness, whatever, that obtrudes itself upon us, that invites that conceptualization, that invites the idea that it's irreducibly subjective, that invites the idea that it's got no, as you say, no sort of backside to it, you know, no hidden nature to it.
Although
it's fully revealed.
And what you just said, sorry to steamroll. I'm going to steamroll. What you just said is not as innocuous as it sounds. So
what was
it was something like play back the tape, but there has to be something.
There has to be.
You said something along the lines. There has to be something that.
It's
very tempting to say like there's something there, and there has to be something that explains why it's so compelling.
There has to be some explanation of why we find that way of interpreting what's happening so psychologically compelling. It's not
I think that's not as innocuous as you think. I think you might possibly be falling for the tuned deck problem.
Okay, right? I take your point. So I take your point.
The people that don't know what the tuned deck is this magic trick that Dennett discusses that it was invented by a magician that fooled many other magicians. He calls this trick the tuned deck. And he does this trick, and it's just this kind of like, you know, is this your card sort of thing. But the magicians couldn't figure out how he was doing it, because they would think like, oh, he's using the Fibonacci method, and so they're looking for the Fibonacci method, and it wasn't that. And the secret to how he pulled this off for years is that he just changed which trick he was using. And so the illusion was that they were thinking there was a single explanation.
Okay.
And it might be the case that there isn't a single explanation, and that's the explanation. So it might be. So one possibility of why the phenomenal redness, in this safe use of the word phenomenal redness, this like subjective redness, it seems like there's something there, even though it's not explained in terms of the external world. We don't understand how the internal world explains that. There has to be some reason why that we find that so compelling. Maybe the reason we find it so compelling is simply because we have no reason to not find it compelling, which that might sound like just moving words around, but it isn't. It might not be there's some single psychological explanation for our failure to understand how color vision works.
That's no, I totally. I'm not. Yeah, I shouldn't have said must. I
Okay,
said,
okay, but I just wanted to highlight that because I do think that something like what I was, worried that you were doing, I think that that's a big player in the way a lot of this stuff gets its uptake in the scientific community that's trying to investigate consciousness scientifically.
Well, I mean, I'm only looking for the psychological explanation. If this is an illusionist perspective, not a realist one, but so what you're so you as Dan uses the tune deck against the phenomenal realist, you're the person who thinks there's a hard problem, you're trying to use it as a quietist against the person who thinks there's a persistent a systematic psychological illusion. There's some explanation of why on each individual case where someone finds these zombie intuitions compelling, there's some explanation, some psychological explanation for it, which might avert, to the fact that they'd just been to Philosophy 101 or something, and they'd had their heads addled by some professor or whatever. So there's some psychological explanation, I assume, on each
or
case.
Other some
or other, yeah, okay,
or some or more psychological explanation.
But on each case, there's some token explanation. Is it the same in every case?
Right.
Well, this is a matter of psychology. Okay, I mean, I guess it would be. The simplest hypothesis is that there's something about the nature of introspection and the way that we introspect sensory states that disposes this. If you say, well, I'm going to start with the hypothesis that there are 117 different explanations for this, and I'm going to try and find all of them. Well, let's start with one and see how far we get with that. And if we say no, that doesn't account for these cases, okay, we'll go to 2, 3, 4, whatever. But we start with the simplest one. That's basically the illusionist perspective, is that people are being continually confused by this in case after in many different environments. Lots of people say that they've thought up these intuitions. They've come up with these intuitions as kids, about inverted spectra and so on, before they encounter philosophy. These people seem to keep making this same mistake over and over again, and finding it, once they've made it, at least very compelling and very hard to unmake, and very hard to get out of this picture. There's this sort of, this picture just grips them. And now that might be indication that there are all sorts of different ways in which you can mislead yourself about this, but it might also be an indication that there's some feature of human psychology. Now let's investigate it and see.
Yeah.
I don't think we can. This isn't a philosophical issue so much as a matter for political investigation. It's
well, good thing we're also scientists, Keith. We don't have to shut up.
But so I think I'm just trying to. So insofar as so let's just see if I can just sort of get a sort of overview of this. We both can see that there's a sense in which you could use the word phenomenal, which is innocuous. I mean, I've been talking with Nick Humphrey about this, because he uses the word phenomenal in this innocuous sense, and it confuses people because they think. We both gave talks recently at a conference, and someone came, and in my talk I was saying how much I agreed with Nick, and then Nick started giving his talk and using the word phenomenal quite a lot, talking about phenomenal properties, and afterwards someone came to me and said, why did you say you agreed with Nick? Because it's completely different points of view. He was completely denying what you said. He wasn't. He was using phenomenal in this sort of sense that doesn't rule out functional. Okay, so he was using it for this expressive response to stimulation. Okay, which he thinks is a central aspect of human experience, not just human experience. So phenomenal / functional. So anyway, so we agreed that that's a component of the notion of a phenomenal consciousness, and in thinking and trying to conceptualize, think of zombies, we're imagining that being all switched off, which would be a major psychological difference. Your difficulty is not with that notion, but it's with the theoretical embedding in which that notion is placed. And so it seems then that it's not really so much a point about demonstration, because we can point at, and say that redness there, which is either an after image created by my visual system, or is painted across the wall and I can't tell which now, but it's that redness there. That bit we can do fine. We can point at that and we have words for it and it's no problem. It's articulating the theoretical embedding in a non-circular or at least coherent way. Is that right?
Yeah. Yep.
Because then it seems the bit about pointing and stuff and directing attention isn't so central then.
Well, it's very central because it's helping spell out that the only way things could seem the way to people that they allege things seem to them is if they're in the grip of a theory. There's no way babies are born with the mirror intuition. That's something that has to get in there the way theories get in there. And theories can be partial, theories can be bad. But it's these theoretical conceptual commitments, these beliefs, these semi-conscious judgments that people have that is making them think to themselves that they have some kind of grip on so-called phenomenal consciousness. Okay, could I sneak two more things in here? Because this, I thought you said a really important thing that I wanted to highlight and make my contribution to the.
Oh, if I've said something important, you can certainly highlight
further investigation.
It was importantly wrong.
You correctly said that that this is for future psychological research, or this is a psychological problem, and I completely agree. Although I would add it's for good psychologists. I wouldn't trust bad psychologists to work on this. And I would also say that I have two bets about where we're going to see some excellent progress in dispelling the illusion, or whatever you want to call it. One of them is that we really should notice how many of us have taken for granted the so-called easy cases. And I'm using easy not to reference Chalmers' easy versus hard, but I want to reference the differential attitudes we have to so-called primary qualities versus secondary qualities. So things like the perception of color, this perception of flavors and odors, those are the ones that we get this like kind of Galileo problem after we've swept them up into the mind. And very few people wrestle with like, well, how is it that we can be appeared to squarely? Like somehow it's really out there that there are things that have shape, or that there are things that have quantity, and we're able to sense them in multiple ways. And
well, Berkeley did that. Berkeley worried over that.
Well, good for him. I have a lot of beef with Berkeley, but I think he was really good to question the so-called primary and secondary distinction. People just take for granted that in the case of the so-called primary qualities, the way perception works is that we just open the mind hole and then the reality comes in, and now we have some kind of subjective grasp that matches the objective reality. And that's insane when you state it like that. That can't be how it works. And so I think if we spend a lot more time thinking about how that's a difficult problem, not in the Chalmers sense of difficult, just in the like, don't take for granted that perception works that way. People that work in machine vision know exactly what I'm talking about. They know how hard it is to get a robot to see that like that's a cube and not a hexagon. But if more people knew about that, they would, I think, start to appreciate how, that there's more parity between the so-called easy primary cases and the hard secondary cases.
I think that's an excellent point. I think
the other thing I want to advertise is people who come into these discussions with these strong intuitions about like Mary couldn't know what it's like to see red. I would invite them to put a lot more effort into learning what we do know right now about color and color perception. Once you dig into some of that and appreciate what some of the main theories are about how that works, and you get into stuff about like, well, why is it that we think that equal luminance samples of yellow and blue are such that the yellow is nonetheless lighter? Look, what is it in terms of the neurophysiology that would predict that you would have that judgment that even though in some objective sense they're equally bright, yellow still seems like a brighter hue than red. I'm sorry, a brighter hue than blue is what I was trying to say, but also that red seems kind of intermediary with respect to brightness, even though they're really of the same lightness value. When you start to appreciate the relationships between the different kinds of spectral discrimination that we're able to make in virtue of the three main receptor cells that we have in our retina, and how that relates to the different colors via opponent process theory, which is not fully confirmed. But once you get your head around like this very plausible hypothesis about at least partially how some of these things work, you start to get more of a handle on how most of your intuitions were guided by primary school color mixing. And that's not how visual experience works at all. You don't have, right, like Hume and a couple of these other 17th century people allowed us to think that like what's happening in the mind is you have these sensory experiences, then you get copies of those sensory experiences, and then you combine those sensory experiences in somewhat of the same way you would mix colors. And so a lot of people that focus on red, right? It's about Mary and red, not Mary and dark red. It's not dark red Mary. It's just red Mary. If it was purple Mary, like people would start to think like maybe she could figure out purple. But a lot of those intuitions are guided by a certain empirical theory about how, or an empirical hypothesis about how color vision works, that many parts of which we already know are wrong. And once you get a handle on the ways in which trichromicity works, there's all sorts of combinations of light that will give you a red experience. And this is something we've known for hundreds of years. You start to notice all sorts of similarity relations and difference relations between the experiences that you didn't notice before. And you start to get more of a handle on how this stuff might actually be explainable. And I also want to advertise along these lines an excellent paper by Paul Churchland called Chimerical Colors, where he talks about how having this kind of theory in hand allows you to predict the existence of qualia that no one, and not even the reader, had experienced. And so some of these are these experiences of shades of yellow that are exactly as darkest black, and experiences of saturated colors that are more saturated than any naturally occurring reflective or emitting color source could be. So like hyperbolic or super saturated orange or super saturated teal. Some of this dovetails with a scientific paper that recently came out about the laser stimulation creating some of these after images that give rise to these color, dare I say, qualia that most people haven't experienced before. But like a bunch of little Marys, we can understand in advance what they would be like, and we could predict from the third person data that there would be such things. And I was just saying that once you get more familiar with this kind of stuff, you might follow me and feel the intuitions melt away.
Well, I don't think it's incompatible with my talk of illusion, that the illusion is to some extent penetrable.
This is not a brief against illusionism. I'm just saying I agree with you that it's psychological and kind of in the spirit of like there might be a tuned deck thing going on here. I think given my views, I couldn't rule that out. I mean, I wasn't bringing this up because you might disagree with that. I'm just to urge the audience, if they want to know more about this and in the right way, here are things, especially if you're a psychologist or a neuroscientist listening to this, here's some stuff that I invite you to go get
absolutely
deeper
into. I think that, and it's fascinating stuff. We'll need to wrap up soon, but I just want to give people who are listening a chance. If anyone wants to ask a question, to Pete in particular, since he's been it's his view we've been discussing, pop it in the questions in the comments now, and I'll ask it. And while you're doing that, let me just put something to you, Pete. Nick Humphrey's work, and you know that I like it very much, and
I like it too.
Yeah,
and you got me into it.
One of his claims. He doesn't particularly like the word illusion, but he does think there's a very strong evolved basis to this self-image that we have of having a magical inner world, a world that does seem irreducibly subjective and deeply special, metaphysically important. And he thinks that's highly adaptive thing to have, and that it's there are very good reasons why it was selected for. Well, I suppose I'm just asking you, do you find that perspective at all persuasive? That I mean, you my sense is that you think this is just a confusion that's been propagated mainly by philosophers. And that we'll just get over it and we'll see things better. Do you have any sympathy for the idea that it's actually a very adaptive part of our manifest image, that just as the way in which we our manifest image of the world around us, it's been designed to highlight bits that are important for us, features that are important for us for survival purposes? So our manifest image of our own minds has been shaped for purposes of well, ultimately for I guess for survival. But
two things really
our lives
really capture my imagination and attention from Nick Humphrey's account. One of them is just the data that he presents in the form of the history of human art and literature, and all of the focus that we have put into, for example, in novels, just describing the scenery, describing these sensory experiences. It's so obviously important to humans to focus on that. And then we read about it and we get lost in it, like a really good writer who's really good at conveying that stuff. When you start pressing people for answers to questions like, well, what's the meaning of life? You get basically what Wilfrid Sellers said about qualia. Qualia are what make life worth living. And so Humphreys does like a really compelling job of presenting the evidence for that case. That really impressed me. And then the second thing that impressed me about him is this very far out hypothesis of his that is, I would put it, and I don't know if Nick likes this, but here's kind of the Mandic version of it. Once you get these talker thinkers, nature has to worry about us doing things like committing suicide because we have this ability to just kind of get lost in thought, right? We could just go fuck off and do something completely dangerous and counterproductive. So lobsters don't need this. Lobsters, you could just, as Mother Nature, you build in a mechanism that to not eat themselves, right? But with these weird apes, with all this extra thinking and talking, you need something to keep us focused on ourselves and on the group. And nature gave us orgasms. Nature gave us the ability to care about what other people are experiencing and whether they have a good time. And maybe we've, in our contemporary alienated modern society, have cut ourselves off from a lot of that. But like, there's something really deeply compelling when you read, in part because Humphreys himself not only has great taste in literature, he's an excellent writer too.
Yes.
So you read this stuff, and even though it's not an argument with numbered premises and all that, it's very compelling. And so that idea that, Sellers was right. He had crazy ideas about qualia, but it's what make life worth living is that's a really interesting and compelling evolutionary hypothesis that this gets kind of bolted on later to keep us from.
Though actually, Nick thinks it's not just a human invention. Though he thinks it's really I mean, that's in the latest book in Sentience. It's all warm-blooded creatures. I think I remember. I mean, there's a development of it, but I mean the I'd need to go back and read, but he certainly thinks it's this. I mean, he has these wonderful examples of creatures playing and just enjoying repeating the sliding down the snow and dipping their hands in the water and just enjoying their engagement with their environment. Just
one of the great things about the internet, and people have been saying this for years, have been cat videos, and the broader phenomenon of social media posts that really are highlighting things like animal friendships, interspecies friendships, like the duck that became friends with the turtle, and all these videos of animals like capybaras and stuff, just having fun and doing things that are obviously like involving like planning, and like, for example, dogs going down water slides and stuff like that. And you see that there's so much joy in nature, and it's not just red and tooth and claw. A lot of them are really having fun. And we're in addition to sharing these videos like cat memes, also there's been a lot of breakthroughs in the past, just recent decades, about animal intelligence that a lot of the stuff about corvids, or tool use in other great apes, like that's fairly recent. Not like yesterday recent, but like I think of like, the past 20 years, that's recent for an old guy like me.
The corvids are
it's amazing stuff. And really, so I think I think that stuff's really compelling, but really mostly compelling in the human case. Like we have these amazing capacities for really complex forms of sympathy and understanding.
I'd certainly Nick thinks it's most highly developed in humans, of course. Let's look.
And dogs.
Yes. Well, we've bred them for it.
They bred us.
Some questions. So Pete hates the ability hypothesis. What about Keith? Well,
it's the worst hypothesis ever.
If it's supposed to be a hypothesis, an explanation of an answer to the hard problem, then I don't think it's needed. I guess Mary does acquire some new abilities. She acquires the ability to recognize red things on sight.
Nope.
No, she doesn't. No, she doesn't. Well, why?
I mean, she never saw them before, but she could recognize them.
Oh, she could recognize. I said recognize them on sight, by sight.
She was already able to recognize them on sight. She just had never seen them before.
But not in the same, not by the same, you're not using the same pathways, visual pathways. I mean, it's trivial.
Oh, I agree with I don't disagree with any trivial points.
But I mean, she can recognize them simply by eyeballing them. Without any other engagement or any other cognitive processes. As I say, it seems to me trivial. But it's supposed to, insofar as it's offered as an answer to some what is it supposed to be an answer? It's an answer to it's a deflationary. Sorry, I'm getting a little tired, but it's a deflationary response. It's a response that doesn't concede that she learns any new thick propositional. Is that me making the noise there, or is it your?
There's a lawnmower or somebody.
All right.
You might hear a motorized thing on my end of things.
Oh yes, I can.
Yeah, now I think it's a leaf blower. I apologize.
Yeah. Why do you hate it so much? Tell me why you hate it so much.
Several different reasons. One of them is that I think the best way to come at this problem is to think in general about what it's like phraseology, and not just the very hyper-specific Mary seeing red thing, but just in general when people know what it's like in cases where it's not even about experience. Just like, do you know what Paris is like, or what was it like? What was it like for London when they came out of World War II? Not necessarily about experience. It's just about what properties or things have. That's what they are like, and then you could have knowledge of that.
All right,
so you look at that stuff. A general kind of just flat-footed propositional knowing that analysis of knowing what it's like seems to look way more plausible. In the cases where imagery or recognition seems to be implicated, the ones that most seem to have some kind of relevance for knowing what it's like are ones in which you would only know what to imagine if you had some prior knowledge of what to imagine. Like the imagining itself really isn't doing any work. You don't need to have the image in your mind to it's evidence that you knew what, like my ability to draw a dog evidences that I know what dogs are like. I know what dogs are. I know what the parts of dogs are and how they're constructed. That's all knowing that. The actual imagining is something extra. Recognizing is the same thing. If I recognize this thing as a dog, I know that this thing I'm now presented with in some way or another is a dog, and I could recognize things even if the way it's presented to me is purely textual. I could recognize that based on these numbers that are coming in from the sonar analyzer, I could recognize that, oh, that's a Russian sub, right? But it's not like I'm recognizing it because I'm hearing the sub or seeing the sub. Yeah, I hate the ability hypothesis.
So what we should say is though she acquires new ways to recognize things, something like that.
I think that what happens when she experiences red for the first time is that she experiences red for the first time, and trivial stuff that just logically follows from experiencing red for the first time. Well, it's no longer the case that she hasn't experienced red for the first time. I don't think we should give aid and comfort to anybody who has the Mary intuition, that they should have it beaten out of them, that Dennett was right all along about the blue banana. Mary won't learn a goddamn thing.
The blue banana.
Mary's not going to learn anything.
I forget about the blue banana, but she has to recognize the blue banana by tracking facts about herself, tracking facts about her own reaction to the blue banana.
If you knew more about color vision, you would appreciate how much she already knows. So I was making.
Tells it though. She does it because what she knew was how she would react to a blue banana. I believe.
But there's all sorts of things that she can know in advance about that. So, for example, just by having color experiences, you have access to a certain, like online, certain kinds of value filtering. Right. Someone who only sees in black and white can nonetheless appreciate the difference between putting a red gel filter on the front of a camera lens versus a blue gel filter. There's all sorts of differences in black and white photography based on what spectral filtering was going into the production of the image. And because of these differences in the way that the lightness values show up in the image, you are in a position to know, based on other knowledge about, like, well, headstones are usually made out of stone, sunlight usually, like if this is outdoors and the shadows are this and this length and this a noonday sun, you can have all this information that would already be telling you that what this object is reflecting is predominantly blue light versus red light. And I agree even more if you can move your head around. So it's actually very plausible that Mary, the first time she steps out of her room and she looks at the tomato, she could already know that based on stuff that she learned solely from all her black and white experiences, that's red.
I think I probably agree with that. That's if we really take the thought experiment as it's officially presented, she knows absolutely everything. Okay, and knowing absolutely everything means that you can do all sorts of you can do practically anything.
Right, but what I'm interested in is emphasizing how much we don't need her to be physically omniscient. That I think that when we have the theory of color vision, we're not going to be that far from where we all are already, and that people having the intuition to the contrary are in the grip of the Cartesian theater intuition, whereby to know what red is like is to have it right there in the mind, and she doesn't have it in the mind, so she doesn't know what it's like. That's all it is, and that's terrible for all the reasons that Dennett spelled out about homuncular fallacies, etc. Once you purge yourself of that, there's really no motivation for continuing to have that intuition.
I agree. I completely agree with you.
But once you get to know more about color theory, you appreciate the ways in which, she would be able to recognize it, and not because she's godlike, just because she already knows the stuff that most people who have these intuitions haven't read about. They don't know the current color theory.
I agree that we should push that. Then that is ultimately, I think, the bottom line. But I think what a lot of people are imagining, though, in these cases, they are imagining situations where she doesn't have that degree of knowledge, and maybe a bit of ability talk is another way of easing them out of those intuitions. That in any normal implementation of this scenario, she would gain new abilities. And that might help pushing that way, which is compatible with pushing also in your way, that if she really understood how color vision worked, she would already have the abilities. And in weaker implementations, more realistic ones that the people who read the thought experiment but don't have the color theory envision, she will probably gain new abilities. I mean, so you can maybe push both ways. Both have a dialectical purpose.
I think the most interesting thing to push in is people should go read a paper by Kathleen Akins and Martin Hahn that showed up in an anthology edited by Josh Weisberg.
Right.
And it's their response to David Rosenthal's excellent paper about Mary called "There's Nothing About Mary." Kathleen Akins, many people might know, was one of Dennett's postdocs at Tufts long in the 80s, long ago. And a lot of her career subsequent to that has been about color vision. And in concert with her husband, Martin Hahn, also a philosopher at Simon Fraser University, they've been developing this theory of color vision, which is very heavily influenced by neuroscience. And a lot of what they're arguing is stuff that I could put simply, like, for example, we have this tendency of thinking of color vision and black and white vision as two different things, or as you might put it, vision for spectral discrimination and vision for luminance discrimination are two separate things. And they argue that no, you really cannot separate them like that. And another thing that they are arguing against, what is kind of a fairly widespread orthodoxy, especially among people who aren't in this stuff, is that you need a lot of concepts and conceptual knowledge to be able to experience colors the way we experience colors. So the idea that babies are born being able to see red, and then later on learn that, like, well, red is often associated with blood. No, that's not how it works at all. It's kind of backwards. Describing it that way. And so part of what they want to say about Mary is this idea that, like, she could have black and white experiences without ever having any of these red experiences is already just, like, based on a completely false theory, empirical theory of how color vision works.
Yeah, Pete, I'm really fading out now, and so
okay.
But I'd just like to put to you some of the questions, because I did ask people for questions. Mark has just pointed out quite correctly that what I said was stupid, and he's right. So yes.
Wow, that was brutal.
Well, he didn't put it like that. I put it like that.
Okay.
But it was stupid. I'm extremely. It's pretty late here now. So let's just quickly, and you can just give like let me see where there's a short answer to the. So dear, I'm losing them now. Okay, here's one. There's one for you, Pete.
Why can't an epistemic orientation isomorphism explain Mary's astonishment? Because there's nothing outside of the epistemic. So the idea that there's this epistemic stuff, and then there's this other stuff, qualia, that you can have access to or plug in. I think that's a broken idea. That no.
Okay, here's one from
can't
have. Does it bother you? I'm not sure. I guess this is what's for both of us.
Yeah. Yes.
I think we can both just say yes.
The answer is yes.
Yes to that one. Yes, it does. And
I think it's worse even than is suggested in this line. You know, if someone wanted to be really conspiracy theoretical, you could you could say that there's certain kinds of political movements that really have benefited from emphasizing the myth of the individual and the importance of the solitary private unit.
Yeah.
Which, that's very advantageous for interests that would also benefit from a downfall of communitarianism. So maybe a lot of the funding that goes into mystical stuff is not simply like, individual gurus who are wellness grifters, but large movements that are benefiting from giving moral cover to the sorts of stuff that supports anti-democratic, theocratic organizations. So
I agree with that, though. I would be cautious in. I'm not suggesting you are doing. I just mean that I don't want to suggest that people who argue for these positions are complicit in that. I think
no,
most of them are completely sincere. In
our mutual favorite Phil Goff.
Yeah,
second favorite to philosophy. Goff is extremely progressive person who,
yeah, absolutely,
is a panpsychist and believes in revelation and acquaintance with phenomenal consciousness. And so I wouldn't want to suggest that everybody who has some specific metaphysical views thereby has like bad ethics or bad politics. But I would suggest
with bad actors trying to exploit.
I would suggest that there are bad actors out there that are emphasizing the way certain sorts of things get funded, that are like elevating certain voices over others. And also I want to recommend people take a look at a recent-ish paper by Matthias Michel and Hakwon Lau that is about the science of consciousness and the way in which a certain kind of emphasis on these metaphysical and epistemological views has had a bad effect on science, has had an effect of making science anti-democratic. So that's narrower and just focusing on science, but that's an excellent paper. Michelle and Lau. I think it was in one of the Journal of Consciousness studies, special issues on the meta problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Was that edited by Francois Cameron? Yes,
Cameron edited that. So people should track down that article.
I think this is something. I think where we should be careful, I think, is in when we engage in philosophical debate, trying to sort of appeal to these social political aspects as if that's another stick we can use to beat our opponents. I think that's a mistake. I think we should
totally agree.
I think we should all be aware in our own case of how our views might be misapplied. I think the best thing to do and I think many of them are aware of this, if you think your views are capable of being misapplied or exploited by bad actors, call it out yourself. I think that's what we should all be.
I think you're exactly right, Keith. I don't think that there's any particular metaphysical view or epistemological view that would lead to some specific ethical or political outlook and not some other, or vice versa. Nonetheless, there are people out there that are linking these things either on purpose or not. And I do think it's very interesting and important to think about all of that stuff. So for example,
maybe that's another topic that we might be worth thinking a bit about the social and political context of
so here's an analogy, right? There's nothing intrinsically bad about movies. I think we can agree.
Mm-hmm.
Nonetheless, just to pick something out of thin air, fascists have used cinema to promote fascism. So have non-fascists. But it is interesting, at least to some people, to look at the very specific ways in which fascists did it. To look at fascist cinema and see, what were the things about cinema that really seemed to be appealing to the fascists and effective for the fascists. That's not an indictment of cinema.
Absolutely.
You're not going to cure fascism by getting rid of movies. But it nonetheless is interesting to look at and to think about. And sometimes you find surprising things, like such and such thing was invented, not by a political group, but it was invented by filmmakers, or vice versa. That's all interesting stuff. And
maybe that's a topic for another time. That's maybe was something we could visit. Well,
we might have some interest from Eric Linus Kaplan coming on to talking about exactly that.
Great. Yes, we may have guests in future.
Yes.
So it's not every time. So if anyone has people they'd like to suggest who they think would be amenable to persuasion, or might even persuade us, by all means suggest them in the comments, and we'll consider it. Pete, I'm fading rapidly, so I'm going to sign out now. But great talking to you.
Likewise.
I'm pretty convinced that I don't have a clear. Despite the fact of talking about illusion, I do suspect that the notion of phenomenal consciousness does contain deep incoherences, and it is a good deal more circular than a lot of people think. So I'm very tempted to say that I don't know what we're even talking about. And you've made a good case for it, I think. So,
but maybe it gets rehabilitated. It becomes like the thing Nick Humphreys was
well, that would be great. You see, I'd love to do that, but just got to be, the thing is, if we do that, people will say, "Oh, you're trying to answer the hard problem." You've got to be. This is one reason why we need to be very careful with thinking about terminology here. I want a term for this. I'm actively looking. I'll be talking to Nick about it. But one thing I think we can conclude is that we don't need to worry about zombies, about our being zombies or not being zombies. We just enjoy being who we are and having the kind of experiences
and
we
drawing
do.
Zombies.
And drawing zombies. Excellent conclusion. Okay, bye everyone. Go and draw some zombies. Bye.